Good evening, everybody. My name is Anne Emerson. I'm a member of Stamford and Rutland in Amnesty International Group who have organised this event this evening. And it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you all to Stories and Poems from the New Wars by the Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group. Very shortly, I'll introduce you to our two guests this evening, who will give an overview of their work, looking at how war and conflict is changing and how this affects arts-based peace-building work in and through education and its link with social justice. Following this, there will be the opportunity to answer questions submitted by you. So all the way through this, as you're listening, we're going to encourage you to ask questions, and I'll explain how you'll do that in a moment. We really appreciate you joining us and giving your support for our local Amnesty and group, but more importantly, your support for social justice and human rights. Having had a sneak preview of this evening, I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm very confident you're going to have a really interesting and moving event. So just before we get to that, a little bit of background information. This is an event that's being recorded, and it will be available in due course on the festival YouTube channel, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that later. This event is part of Amnesty's 60th birthday celebrations. Amnesty International is a movement of 10 million people around the world standing up for humanity. And this festival has brought together 40 local Amnesty groups and a wide range of community organisations who are all keen to spread the word about social justice and human rights by organising over 50 free events. So these have been running for a little while, but the good news is that they're still carrying on until the 31st of May, so you have time to join in some more of these after this evening. Very briefly, a little information about housekeeping. Hopefully you've seen the ground rules while you were waiting to come into the webinar, and these are still available on your screen under the question or chat heading that you will find in the control panel at the top right of your screen. If at any point you lose your connection or you're having some technical difficulties, I'm afraid the best we can suggest is that you close the webinar and come back, and hopefully that will solve the problem. So we're really thrilled that you're here, but I'm afraid we won't see or hear you this evening. So you won't be in the recording. That may be some comfort to you, but we do want you to participate. Don't use the hand up function, although you might be used to using that in other formats. That won't work here. And we are also not using the chat function. So what we are asking you to do is to submit questions through the questions box in the control panel, but also to make comments about what you're hearing. The questions will only be seen by the webinar presenters and panelists. And if you have a question for a particular person, please put their name at the beginning. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as possible, and we apologise in advance if we don't get to yours, but hopefully we will. Lastly, we really obviously want this to be and feel like a safe space for everybody, and we support freedom of expression that demonstrates respect to others. Thank you for listening to this background information. And now, without any more delay, I'm really delighted to start the event and introduce you to our two speakers, Hilary Cremin and Layton. Firstly, Dr. Hilary Cremin is co-founder and senior advisor to the Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group. Hilary is reader at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge. She researches and teaches peace building in and through education in settings in the UK and elsewhere. And with her this evening is our second guest, Layton, who is a student of the research group, creative director of Undiscovered Country and senior associate of independent thinking. He is also the recipient of the Minon Art Award for the Minon Concert Organization in Japan for his contribution to peace through education and culture. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you very much, Anne, and welcome to everyone. It's an absolute delight to be here with you on this Monday evening. And Roy and I are going to be hosting this event and taking you through what we hope will be a series of really interesting stories and poems about the new wars and the way that our work towards peace is changing in response to the new wars, and in particular the way that we use the arts through our work. So I'm just going to start by introducing Cperg, Cambridge Peace Education Research Group, which is a group within the Faculty of Education in Cambridge. It's made up of largely graduate students, and these are people doing masters and PhDs who are researching peace. And we have people at the moment who are researching in places like Syria and Afghanistan and India, as well as parts of the UK and parts of Europe. So we are an eclectic group who come together around our shared interest in peace building and education. So that's what we do. Why do we do it? Because we believe that learning about peace is fundamental and part of the role of education. We feel that every young person should leave their educational experience understanding a little bit about how to resolve conflicts non-violently and how to bring about peace. And we also believe that education systems themselves should be free of violence and coercion, and that therefore we need to think very carefully about the way that we organise education in order to model and embody the kinds of values that we feel are important. So it's great that we're here as part of this Social Justice Festival in order to share our insights on how we're working towards peace. So Roy, what about from a student's perspective? How would you introduce Cperg and the work that we do from a student's perspective?
Well, I'm one of the oldest students there, and I'm on the master's course doing knowledge, power, and politics. And as a student body, certainly within that faculty and that pathway, it's very much geared towards practical application, moving the theoretical into action. And I suppose that Cperg could be seen as an activist group of people that want to go beyond just the mere academic referencing and investigation into peace, but taking that research and taking those very insightful conversations and lectures that we have and putting them to good use. And Cperg creates an excellent pathway for that. And it also creates many opportunities for the student bodies to work on different projects globally, and particularly we're looking at the Poetic Offerings for Peace at the moment, and we're just doing our first global classroom event next month, if anyone's interested. But I think from a student's point of view, Cperg enables us to move the theory into action.
Thanks, Roy. I would definitely agree with that. So I'm just going to start by saying a little bit by way of introduction about what we mean when we say that war is changing, and that because of that our efforts towards peace are also evolving. So the model of war that we have that was from the last century about war between nation states is being eroded. It's changing. So wars nowadays are just as much likely to be within regions and states, civil wars and so on, often around identity issues. wars have always involved civilians, but increasingly wars are happening in our towns and in our cities, and they're not so much involving discrete battlegrounds. We've got drones, sadly, and technological advances, which means that people can be killed from thousands of miles away. And the effects of that, the dehumanizing of the act of killing, is, I think, quite chilling. So certainly drones and the damage that's caused by drones is a factor of the wars. Wars nowadays are called on abstract notions such as terror and so on. And so it's become a phenomenon that's beyond traditional reasons for war, which might have been around territory or geopolitical power and so on. And also our geopolitics is changing. Our view of history is changing. So, for example, we might have the narco trade in Latin America and America, which is changing the experience of violent conflict, armed conflict in that particular part of the world. Post-colonialism is changing the way that we think about conflict and violence. And new forms of genocide are emerging, where sections of the population are at greater risk from the police or from the army, which are sometimes passing under the radar in ways that are changing from the point of view of the international community. Be very interested in people's ideas about that who've been involved in Amnesty and what their thoughts are about it. I think because of that, when we think about working towards peace, it's very important that we think about interpersonal relationships, the seeds of conflict and violence, the way that people view the other, the way that people think about themselves as citizens, not just of their own country, but also citizens of the world, and what that means. It's important that people learn to love their planet, learn to love the environment because of the impacts of sustainability on global conflict and violence, global warming. So we need forms of education that are engaging, that are embodied, that are about the here and now, and that bring people together in meaningful relationships, both in the locality and also across the planet as well. And one of the ways that we found to work towards that has been through arts. Did you want to say a bit more about that, Roy? Because you've got a background in the arts, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been using arts-based methodologies with schools and also in businesses for about 30 odd years. And I think the reason why the arts are so powerful and the emerging research around this, particularly from Innsbruck, is that we've approached our peacekeeping in a very rational way, which has led to a really good logical argument of why we should not fight and why we should have peace talks. But what it's missing is the soul, and the evidence is both the intellectual evidence, but also more importantly, I would say, the actual experience of what the arts can do to create the conditions for peace. So I suppose my work has been about creating the conditions for peace, using art, using drama particularly. And I think what we see within Cperg is a real commitment and a rigor around that. When I work with people, and again, it'd be really interesting to get people's questions and thoughts on this. I ask people if they've ever had an intuitive, a gut feeling about something that they've acted upon, and it proved to be the right thing. And everyone I've ever spoken to says yes. And then that then begs the question, well, why don't we utilize this? When we look at the arts, Gabrielle Roth, for example, who's a dancer, who's a bit about creating the embodied experience and music and dance. She says, I began to see more clearly that art is not just ornamental, an enhancement of life, but a path in itself, a way out of the predictable and the conventional, a map to self-discovery. Still, it was just intuition until I could live it, use it. And I love that, but the point I would take issue with her is it was just intuition. I think art is actually about really celebrating intuition, and whether or not it's music, whether or not it's movement, whether or not it's theatre, that one moment where people go, what just happened there is the doorway into dialogue and the beginning of peace. And unless we can get that shared, unknown, unspoken experience, we're highly unlikely to get peace, because people haven't connected at a heart-to-heart level.
Yeah, thank you, Roy. I think that's a really good time to actually show people what it is that we're talking about. So we have 3 pre-prepared videos today that we're going to be sharing with you, and then I'm going to read one of my poems that's actually about peace building through education, the role of the peace educator. But the first one is by Dr Hogai Aryoubi, who graduated a year ago now, and she's an Afghani American, and she left Kabul at the age of 2 days old with her mum and her dad, and they trekked across Europe. And to cut a long story short, she was a refugee until arriving in America. And then she arrived in the UK to do her PhD with me, having felt that her Afghani identity was very strong, but having never actually been back to Kabul since she was 2 days old. And when she did go back, she had an encounter, various encounters, that made her feel that when she got home, she needed to do a lot of reflection and thought. And she talks about this in a poem that she'd like to share with us.
Hello everybody, my name is Hogai Aryoubi, and I want to read you a poem that was a part of my PhD. It was written after I came back from my fieldwork in Afghanistan, and it's called A Hyphenated Identity. A hyphenated identity. Before I went to Afghanistan, I knew I was Afghan. A born in Kabul Afghan, a full citizen Afghan, a Muslim majority Afghan, a fluent in the tribal language Afghan. Then I visited Afghanistan. I was told I was American, another immigrant American, another naturalized American, another minority American, a fluent in American. I came back to Cambridge. I could no longer deny the hyphen, the bridge that merges my 2 worlds, not fully one or the other, but an acceptance of my past and present, an Afghan American. It seems settled, but there's a gap when you become a hyphen, something missing in the middle. Not fully here or there, not fully part of either world, a forced acceptance of being Afghan in America and American in Afghanistan. When there's no acceptance, perspective can't help, because you can't force belonging, and living in your own world is lonely. So you live on this bridge of a hyphen and join the rest of the diaspora of a lost people trying to fit in somewhere. That is the end of my poem, and I wrote this poem to express my thoughts and feelings when I came back from my fieldwork. I had some difficulties writing this out in objective writing, so I used poetry to express my feelings. I could not remove myself from my thoughts and feelings in an objective way and still try to make the reader really understand what I thought and felt. Therefore, these poems were able to help me do that. Thank you, everyone.
Wow. It's incredible, isn't it?
She is such an amazing woman. She is an inspiration to the other students who are part of this movement, this academic creative movement. I found that so moving.
Yeah. She actually, when she was in Kabul, she focused on 5 women and their stories about education or not being able to access education. And she wrote each one up with such detail and such loving tenderness, including describing how she would go to their home and where they'd sit on the floor and how they'd take tea. She just wrote a whole narrative about the stories that she gathered there. That the actual, her PhD was just so engaging that both of her examiners, both her internal and her external, who was Professor Ruth Leach from Queen's University Belfast, they both said that they couldn't put it down. And believe you me, when you're examining a PhD, it's not very often that you can't put it down. But she just transported her examiners with her stories, and she translated that back also to her own experience. And I would like to bet actually that of the people who are moved and who will be moved by engaging with Hogai's field work, I think there will be more of an impetus for change than 100 reports which give all the dry facts about lack of access to education in Afghanistan. There's something stories which really engage people and make people want to bring about change.
You see, I think you made a really important point, that what Hogai has done, she's told a narrative, she's told a story, and if we bring it back to the arts and the hero's journey, I mean, her whole story is about going through that process of having the call to adventure, accepting the call, crossing the threshold, going through the path of trials, and her trials have been immense.
Yeah.
And we look at the physical trials and the trials of difference, but the real beauty of her piece as an academic piece is the narrative.
Yeah.
And I think what Cperg encourages, and also what I think the KPP in the faculty is encouraging, that this wave of students, this wave of academics, particularly those working towards peace, have got to be able to get the balance right between the power of and the necessity for academic rigor, but the need for artistic expression.
Yeah, and for communication of research findings as well. Yeah. Okay, so shall we move to the next one?
Oh, to Will McInerney.
Will McInerney, who actually he's going to introduce himself and his work in this video. So I won't say much more than to say that Will uses slam poetry in his work. He is a slam poet himself, and his work is about working towards peace through male violence reduction programs. So he works with ex-offenders, with gangs, with people in prisons, and so on. And this piece of poetry that he's going to share with us today, 2 poems actually, are about why he does his work, and he's written that in the form of poetry.
Hi, my name is Will McInerney, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, where I work with Hilary Cremin. I'm also a member and a former co-chair of Cperg. It's an honor to be here with you all today, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. First, though, my background is broadly in peace and arts education, poetry, performance, and storytelling, and men's violence prevention work, which is what my current research looks at. And so I look at men's violence through a gendered and a feminist-informed lens to try to better understand the links between some men's gender norms and patterns of men's violence. I look at the full spectrum of men's violence, from direct forms of domestic and sexual violence against women to broader patterns of cultural and structural sexism. While not all men commit direct acts of violence in their most blunt forms, almost all men do take part in patriarchal cultures and structures, and, critically, all men can help prevent violence. So my research looks at ways that we can engage men as allies in gender justice and violence prevention. Specifically, I look at one type of program that's often underexplored in the current literature, and that is arts integrated approaches. How can we use the arts to engage more men, and to engage men both effectively and affectively in peace work? Part of what my work is doing now is using the power of poetry and storytelling to better understand these issues. How can poetry help men connect and learn about peace and violence prevention? How can poetry help men speak out on this important issue? I think poetry provides us a way to tap into the complexity of people's narratives and emotions. It combines their analytical thinking, the crafting of metaphor and imagery, the wordsmithing, the craft of poetry, with their affective entanglements in our world, tapping into the intangibles of our lived experiences. It is thus both analytic and affective. And we live in a time of new, evolving, and complex violence. This is a time where we need to listen to those most affected, to amplify their voices. And this is a time where we all need to speak out. We must interrupt our individual and, importantly, our collective silence, the silence embedded and reproduced in our cultures and structures. And I think poetry provides a conduit to do both of those things. I think poetry makes an invaluable tool and a potent process for research on violence and peace and for speaking out on issues of justice. That's why I've done it in my professional practice, and that's why I continue to incorporate it in my research at Cambridge. And so in my short time today, I want to share a poem. Over the past year, I've been working with a range of practitioners and participants from my PhD research, exploring the ways that they integrate the arts into their men's violence prevention programs. And in doing this work, I'm often asked why. Why this focus? Why this approach? And seeking to practice what I preach and to, as our colleague in Cperg, Tim Archer, often says, walk my talk, I wrote a poem talking about how this work is personal for me, how I and those around me have been deeply impacted by men's violence, and why I think that motivates me to work for change, why I believe that change is possible. The title of the poem is An Answer to the Question in 2 acts. 1. Inhale. The reasons are too many to count. Too many men who've caused too much harm too consistently. Masculinity and violence like hand and glove. The statistics sting and correlation on the tip of my tongue all around me. It's like the air that I breathe. You asked me why do I do this work? And I said because of he. He who told me never to cry. He who slapped the tears off my cheek, he who told me man up, he who squeezed my arm till the color of inside came out, he who hurt me inside and out, he who raised that bat to my head, he who cocked back, swung and cracked, he of no remorse, he who left me bloodied, bodied, eyes rolled round under the moonlight, he who pulled that gun on me, he who pulled that other gun, he who pulled that other gun, a symphony of he malevolence, power trip and trigger fingers reaching for crescendo, he who hurt her and her and her and her, a bouquet of he's who've hurt every woman I've ever loved, he who hurt her and him and her and them, he was thief of life, fleece of futures, he who pickpockets lungs, he who put his hands around Ira's neck, he who took her from us, he who put bullets in Dia's teeth, in his ribs, in his head, he who didn't stop there. He who took Yusor, he who took Razan, he who took Miss Mubarak's son, he who took Ahmed's eye, he who took Eduardo's brother, he who took himself, he who took himself, and he, the list grows with each breath, he, and lest we forget the he who thinks he is different, not that kind of he, further down the spectrum of harm kind of he, so it's okay, he, just the he who makes sexist jokes, and the he who doesn't call it out when he sees it, he who bows in silence before the roar of misogyny's laughter, he who thinks feminism is good but doesn't apply to him, so he who holds a chest full of gas waiting to be lit, he, so many he's I can rattle off for days, so many he's who I badly want to be completely different from me, but he who sometimes looks like me who's stayed silent, me who's been wrong, me who's hurt, me who hurts, me who hurts, me, he, me, wishing upon mirrors, wanting binaries between, but knowing all too well that borders bleed and boundaries seed, and I see he whose privilege I breathe, whose culture within I steep, sometimes I fear it's as simple and complex as it seems, he is me. Maybe not this he or that he, maybe not hyper-aggressive, explicit, violent he, but some days and some ways I am he. Complicit he, silent he, structural he, subtle he, so-called woke he, maybe well-intentioned he, but still he. Still the air we breathe. He. 2. Exhale. I do this work because of me and he. He who sees clearly. He who seeks breathing freely. He who believes in possibilities beyond cage binaries. He and he who knows the problem is he and is so far beyond he and he who knows it is stitched in the fabric of our lives, knotted in the structure, so he who puts wrenches in the machines, he who schemes blueprints for escaping gendered boundaries, he who listens to women more than he speaks, follows more than he leads. He was humble and reflexive, courageous and accountable. He was sorry when he is wrong, and he who knows that alone, well, that's just not good enough. He was fed up with all the he violence and all the he forms. He who pledges not to be silent, he who calls out sexism when he sees it, he who supports those who he knows needs it, but he who will fall short, he who will make mistakes, and he who will learn, he who will get better with each time, he who imagines a world with less privilege and power and dominance, he who is not naive or thinks it will be easy to uproot a rotten structure or a toxic culture, but he who works for it feverishly. He who is willing to sacrifice so all can feel that feeling. He who will grow and change and dream. He who imagines breathing freely. He who is we. He and he and he. Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, I think another wow. I love Will. I met Will before I officially started at Cambridge, and I think my conversations with him, particularly about the role that men have in war and the creation of it, but not necessarily the military aspect of it, but the violence that we bring into our communities, the violence that we bring into our homes, and calling it out. The people that should be challenging male violence has to be men.
Yeah.
And that's, I love that. I've heard that before, but I was really moved and touched by that.
It's such a privilege to be working with all of you. But I particularly feel as a woman to be working with Will, who is a male ally and is coming from a feminist perspective, and who just, this is his thing, this is what he does. I just feel incredibly humbled by that. And his written work, the way that he expresses himself, the quality of his research is absolutely outstanding. It really is. I thought that this might be quite a good time to explain one of the main theories that we use. So I really, really hope that everybody's not going to switch off now. This is actually a beautiful theory. This is my favourite theory of all time. It's elegance and it does so much lovely work. So I'm going to challenge myself to explain it really, really succinctly. So Johan Golton was the first professor of peace studies in Norway back in the 1960s. And one of the first things that he had to do was to define what we mean by peace. And he decided that he couldn't do it without referring first to violence, which is interesting about the Western perspective on what peace is. But anyway, he decided that, of course, that we have direct violence, which we would all understand, and direct violence isn't just hitting, it's also verbal violence as well. But we also have structural violence, and later on in life he also spoke about cultural violence. So structural violence is the violence that's built into our institutions, into our societies, into our cultures, into the way that we do things. Structural violence is the violence that means that so many women die at the hands of their violent partners, for example. And cultural violence is the violence by which the structural violence becomes normalized. It becomes acceptable, it's tolerated. And so what Johan Golton said is that if we wish to work towards positive peace, we have to tackle all three forms of violence: direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. And it's only when we tackle structural and cultural violence that we will ever achieve social justice and positive peace. If we just tackle direct violence, if we just focus on peacekeeping, so damping down conflict and violence, keeping warring parties apart, sending in the blue helmets, yes, that has a benefit from the point of view that it might stop people in the here and now from being killed or being injured or being hurt. But it does nothing to address the underlying causes, and violence will emerge again. So structural and cultural violence are latent, and at any moment they can turn into direct violence. So the work that we do in Cperg is about how do we work towards positive peace. And my book with Terence Bevington, called Positive Peace in Schools, is how do we take this theory which comes from international relations and how do we apply it to schools? How do we stop just focusing on peacekeeping in our schools? CCTV cameras and big fences and separating people. How do we work towards social justice in our classrooms? How do we create a culture of peace, which isn't about happy clappy, everybody sitting around being nice to each other? It's actually about tackling some of the conflicts, teaching young people how to resolve them peacefully, and creating the climate both in the school and in wider society where direct violence becomes less likely. I mean, clearly schools are deeply embedded into the societies that they're part of, and there's a kind of an iterative thing going on. But if we don't start with schools and with children and think about what kinds of cultures we want to create, we're doomed to keep perpetuating structural and cultural violence, and then nothing's going to change.
I think that's such an important point, and I wouldn't want people to go away from this meeting thinking this is something that is aspirational. My experience and our shared experience is that are schools engaged in this? I mean, particularly, Carl Manor School in Leeds, and even the City of Leeds, which are very much geared towards a restorative approach and the work of Mark Finnis and others. But what we see, and we should be really celebrating, is that it is possible to create within our schools systems, and it does take time and it does take a process, and the arts are very central to this, to create a means by which we can transform and transcend this. My concern, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Hilary. It's not a question that's pre-prepared, it's just come to me, so I'm going to ask it. Is how do we deal with those schools and those institutions that believe they are peaceful centres, but the violence is palpable? Everyone's playing by the rules, but no one's living in peace. And we've both been in schools that say, oh, we have a very good policy, a behaviour policy, but that behaviour is based on terrorism of the students and the staff. What are your thoughts in terms of how we unpack that and confront the so-called peacekeepers who are in fact the violent perpetuators in this instance?
Yeah. I mean, we see it, don't we, in young people filing in single file along corridors without being allowed to speak, and young people being excluded for wearing the wrong kinds of socks, and the sort of militarization of schools. So schools are either modelled around the prison or the factory or the military. And we seriously need to get over some of our archetypes of what schools actually are, and begin to reimagine them as humane places. I would say, you know, a focus on inclusion, a focus on citizenship, education, a focus on well-being, use of circles, focus on relationships. You've mentioned restorative approaches to discipline, also peer mediation, supporting young people to mediate their own playground disputes, learning how to do that so they can take that out into the community. There are ways in which schools can be supported, and in which staff can be supported as well, to be valued in what they're doing, and not just to feel like a cog in a machine. And we could say so much more about that, and the schools that are already doing that. But we should probably move on to Nomisha, who is final recording. So Nomisha is in Delhi, and she has sent us this recording, which is about the work that she's done with children living in extreme poverty.
Hi everyone, thank you for listening to me today. I'll be talking a little bit about peace we can touch, see, and feel, an embodied way of understanding peace that links to poetry, to nature, and to children's well-being. I'm Nami, in the second year of my PhD, and I work with 11 to 14-year-olds in high poverty settings. I research children's well-being, and I'm curious about how schools can build positive peace, that is, sustainable, lasting, and nurturing peace for children whose lives are touched by different kinds of violence and adversity. I'd like to share this extract by one of my very favorite writers, Robert Mcfarlane, well known for his work on landscape and place. He writes, "On almost every front, we have begun a turning away from a felt relationship with the natural world, a prizing away of life from place, an abstraction of experience into different kinds of touchlessness. We experience, as no historical period has before, disembodiment and dematerialization. The almost infinite connectivity of the technological world, for all the benefits that it has brought, has exacted a toll in the kind of contact. We have in many ways forgotten what the world feels like. And so new maladies of the soul have emerged, unhappinesses which are complicated products of the distance we have set between ourselves and the world." I find this idea so thought-provoking because the need for an embodied understanding of peace comes through to me particularly strongly when I work with children who have been through adversity. I have realized that an embodied understanding of peace can sometimes be the most humane and rich way to help children tell their stories. In this research, collage making proved to be a meaningful way of hearing children's voices and working out how best to listen to them. The children would select flowers, leaves, and feather symbols to show me how they made meaning of well-being and inner peace. One young girl, aged 11, was a victim of forced displacement in her city. When I interviewed her verbally, she did not say anything about her experience, but when she started making her collage, entire stories tumbled out just through the green feather. For her, the feather symbolized a tree next to her old home, one that fostered her inner sense of peace and safety. Her reference to Ganpati signifies a deity in the Hindu tradition of faith that her family follow. She explained, "I'm the girl in the colorful dress, and the green feather is my tree, where I used to live. My tree made me safe. Ganpati is there, sitting on the tree. He lives inside. We used to climb that tree and play around it and give flowers to Ganpati. I miss my tree a lot." She remarked on her experience of losing her home. "All my cousins, my friends, my aunties, my uncles, my tree, all gone. My daddy was born there, and yet all the children have to go. We can do everything, we can pray to Ganpati, but we still have to go. I still dream about my tree. In my collage, I am the girl and I am always carrying the green feather. Other children had similar stories that evoke, in Robert Mcfarlane's words, the importance of honoring a felt relationship with the natural world. They chose butterflies, flowers, trees, and leaves to explain what peace and well-being meant to them. As I do my research, I turn to poetry because I think poetry can capture the embodied nature of peace, how it looks and feels to the touch, in a very powerful way. I'm particularly captivated by Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things. He writes, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sounds and fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and am free." I believe this poem, with its rich sensory imagery, captures Robert Mcfarlane's ideal of the felt relationship with the natural world. I also believe poems like this can rejuvenate our sense of hope when working with people, with children whose lives have been affected by trauma. A pioneer of trauma-informed care notes, "We are a hopeful species, and working with trauma is as much about remembering how we survive as it is about what is broken." Perhaps poetry holds on to these flashes of hope, putting the pieces back together. Thank you for listening to me today. If you have any comments or questions, please do reach out, and I would love to hear from you.
I love
Right.
Nomi. She's so powerful. She
Yeah.
is such a powerful voice. She's such a beautiful. She's one of the chairs of Cperg, and she just brings such consistency and such strength to the work that we do. That was lovely. I haven't seen that one.
Okay, so I think Nomi might be watching tonight. She might be with us actually.
Hi, Nomi.
What would you say? What would you say, Roy, as a response to what she's shared?
Well, I was very moved by that, and I'm rereading Elizabeth Gilbert's book on Big Magic, and she quotes the poet Jack Gilbert,
Mm-hmm.
and what I get from both what Nomi said, but also Nomi as a person, is a courage, and Jack Gilbert is talking about committing to your art, committing to your craft. And he says, "Do you have the courage to bring forth this work? The treasures that are hidden inside you are hoping you will say yes." And that creating the space, not just for the trauma to be unearthed and dealt with, but also the treasures.
Yeah.
And art plays a part in obviously healing, but also it plays an enormous part in revealing that within you that you may have forgotten or other people have forced you to forget. Yeah.
And there's many things that I love about Nomi's work, but one thing that I think is really significant is that she refuses to take a deficit view of children living in slum areas and dispossessed and so on. She actually asks them, what is it that you do that make you feel positive about your life? And so her deep listening, using her lovely art materials and poetry and so on, and really connecting with the children, enables her to come up with some recommendations for how we can support their well-being that are very child focused, and that aren't coming from some report somewhere that's somebody else's idea about what children might need. This is what they're saying. And so in the example that she gave, the fact of the tree and the God for that child, that was her sanity. and that was what really gave her a sense of well-being. There's another one of Nomi's participants who said that she feels like she's in paradise. So she's similarly affected, but she has an opportunity to fulfill her grandmother's wishes and to make something of herself through education. And so she says because of that, she feels that she's in paradise. And you think of, you know, just what's that child sense of well-being and what that tells us about how we can support young people like that to feel like agents in the world, like they've got things that they can do, not as passive victims or as recipients of grant and aid. That active part is so important.
It is, and there are two things that struck me about that. One is her cultural connection with her own divine self. So she's saying, the spirit is in the tree. And we do have a tendency, a colonialized mindset of imposition on a culture one on another, and allowing those groups of individuals, wherever they are, to say, well, how are you experiencing the creative? Ruma Godden, again, she was English, but she was brought up in India and very much influenced by this. She's a children's author. She wrote a book called The Black Narcissus, and in her biography, she said everyone is a house with 4 rooms: an intellectual, an emotional, a practical, and a spiritual. And unless we're going to each room every day, even only to keep it aired, we're not a complete person. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that again, Nomi, to the points you're making, she very quietly is very determined and is not hanging around. And there is a gentle, not impatience. And going back to the Elizabeth Gilbert and the Big Magic book, she says in response to Jack to this point, and you have treasures hidden within you, extraordinary treasures, and so do I, and so does everyone around us. And bringing those treasures to light takes work and faith and focus and courage and hours of devotion. And the clock is ticking and the world is spinning, and we simply do not have time anymore to think so small.
Thank you, Rory. I think probably, do you want to introduce my poem?
I would love to introduce your poem. I know this poem, I've read it several times, and I have to say, when I had to make a decision of coming to Cambridge, I didn't want to come and just do an academic. I wanted to be involved with the community. And there are several factors that made me feel that this was my community. And I make a public declaration, Hilary Cremin, that this poem made me feel that this is a woman I want to work with. This is a community I want to be part of. And I hope this is inspiring to other people that hear it, as it was to me when I first did.
Thank you, Roy. So this is a poem called Peace Educator, and it describes the kind of peace educator that I would like to be. And I first performed this as part of an international peace conference in Istanbul, and they were expecting an academic paper and they got a poem. So this is the poem. I come to you not as teacher, not to appraise, allocate, grade, unless invited, and only then in the spirit of the game. I come to you as gardener, to dig and clear, to sow with you in this garden that's ours for a while. I come to you not as activist. I'm free to enter or leave your world as I desire, so I will never truly understand. I'm not here to give you voice. I do not require your emancipation. You did not create the conditions of your wanting. I did not create the web that contains my daily acts of selfishness, pride, and greed. I come to sing with you, songs that fall into our laps like giggling babies to be cherished, adored, and dressed. I bring songs that fill me, sing us. I come to you not as hero. I've never been tested to give my life for another, so I don't know if I'm a hero. I come to you not as colonizer, with dreams to sell. I do not bring suffocating, homogenizing, packaged peace. I come to you as visitor host. Your space gives warmth, hospitality, connection, nourishment. I come to you as migrant, pilgrim, witness, weaver, dreamer, educator for peace.
Thank you, Hilary. That was lovely. I do hope, and I would encourage anyone who's out there in our last sort of 15 minutes or so, if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, please just post them on Twitter, and we'll take questions in a little while. As you know, I'm part of Independent Thinking, the group that Ian Gilbert set up about a quarter of a century ago. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment is the play paradox. How play is often seen as, and art and creativity is seen as, oh, the thing you do when you're not serious, when you're not doing serious work. But the paradox of it is, certainly in, as we've heard from the speakers, the power of the arts and play to create the conditions, but underneath that playfulness, there is a very serious message. And I think certainly in peacekeeping, in all its forms of peace building and peacemaking, the idea of having play in order to create those conditions is a very serious task. I wouldn't want anyone listening to this think, oh, that's a lovely evening of poetry, but actually it's a very serious and very important thing to observe. What we are seeking to do, even in this short hour, saying, have the experience of the poems, have the experience of what the other members of Cperg have shared, because there are thousands and millions of people out there, each wanting the opportunity to share their creativity, and in doing that, be an activist for peacemaking, peace building, peacekeeping. That was great, Hilary. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. So I think we can move over to comments and questions now. We'd love to get some responses and to find out what people have been thinking whilst we've been doing our various presentations.
Hi, Anne.
Hi, thank you both so much, and your students, absolutely beyond inspirational, really wonderful. And some of the responses that people have sent in really echo that. Very moved by the poetry, very inspired by the way that people are expressing what they're feeling. And thank you to you, Hilary, for joining that. So, questions. Okay, I think Nomi's touched on this a little bit, but the expression positive peace is new for me, and I'd really like to understand a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what I was talking about, that theory earlier about positive and negative peace. The positive piece is where you are addressing the structural and cultural violence. So it might not look terribly peaceful. There might be people having heated debates, and it may be that a school or an organisation appears to be in chaos because everybody is revisiting and reclaiming and thinking about values and so on. But that's the kind of piece that is tackling the structural and cultural violence. Negative piece would be where we just put a lid on it all and we just stop it from coming out in the first place. And I would say that I think schools need to be safe places. We need to think about human rights within the school. We need peacekeeping for basic safety. We need to be able to protect the weak, or those who would be harmed by others. But we can't stop at peacekeeping, and so many schools do. To have ways of making peace when conflict has happened that involve everyone's voice and that are collaborative and that model processes of peacemaking that we would like to see out in the community is really important, as is working towards addressing structural and cultural violence through creating a school culture which works towards positive peace. Is really, really important. So for me, positive peace is dynamic. It can be confrontational. It's about challenge. It's about social justice. It's the opposite of a kind of hearts and flowers view of peace.
And if I can add, Hilary was talking about Johan Golton's work and the idea that people think if we're not falling out, then that's peaceful. Well, actually, no. It's the point about having the lid kept on it. We think we're not arguing, so therefore this is peaceful. I'm not sure if anyone's ever been into a staff room where you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. That is not a peaceful environment, but no one's falling out with each other, but everybody is in conflict.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So it's a very active kind of peace, it sounds like. I should have said before, please everybody remember to put your questions in and I will be able to see them. And so I'm just looking at this. I'm going to read it out because I haven't had a chance to pre-read it. Partly a comment that we are sharing this when Bob Dylan has just celebrated his 80th birthday. Would you agree that you inherit the immense contribution to peace thinking of Dylan, Joan Baez and many others through music in the 1960s, and how can this be brought forward today?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, both Roy and I are old enough to remember that. So. most definitely, yeah. It kind of went out of favour for a bit. I think I'm going to get a little bit political here, but I think in the 1980s with sort of Thatcher and so on, there was a huge drive against peace education, peace work in schools, and it was seen as dangerous and subversive, and stories were circulated about loony lefties and bar black sheep being banned in London schools, which by the way is an urban myth. It didn't. It was. Those stories were generated at the time in order to discredit that way of thinking, and in many other parts of the world, people talk much more openly about peace education, about peace building. Weirdly, it's a dirty word here. People who are working towards peace are somehow perhaps unpatriotic, or they're sort of CND types, or there's a kind of a way that people are stereotyped and categorized, and so I think that's probably why some of that work, some of that beautiful song and poetry that was precisely about peace, seems to have fallen by the wayside, and it most definitely needs to be honoured. And we need to now reconnect with young people in this generation to find out how they want to express their dreams for peace. And we probably also now need to add in sustainability as well with the climate emergency.
And I'm not going to even embarrass myself or any of my daughters who would be mortified if I tried to. What we are seeing now is an emergence in young artists and certain spoken word artists who are being the Bob Dylans and Jansians of now. They've got so much to say, and some of the workshops that we do is actually exploring the spoken word and giving people a space to get that out. What we need are more events such as this, whereby we can get the voice of the peace builders, because I am seeing now a shift in our culture that people of a certain generation have got to the point where they are quite comfortable. But we're seeing the activists generally coming out of the 25s and below. There is a real activist, because without going, onto the environmental model for that. But what we're seeing is young people saying, enough's enough. And the idea of maturity and having that voice expressed, we have to, and I see my role, not necessarily as being a lead activist, but being an individual that can create spaces for young people to see that they are, and they can, and they should.
Thank you. I want to ask a couple of other questions here that are somewhat similar. So I'm going to ask them both together. So one person's asking, how does your work translate, for example, into a morning's work in secondary school? And are you able to observe any changes in a class of young people during a limited time period like a school morning? And together with that, are you actively trying to build peace education into the syllabus at primary and secondary schools? And if so, is there resistance from our educational institutions?
Yes, there's definitely resistance. But our work is international, so some of it we find it easier in other countries than in the UK. It's a real challenge in the UK. I've spent my entire career, I've been doing this work for sort of 30 odd years now. I have to keep reinventing myself and calling it something different. I mean, for a while it was citizenship, education, social, moral, cultural education. You just have to find a language that people can find acceptable. But both Roy and I know a school in Leeds, so talking about what would it look like in a morning in school. So Calm Manor School in Leeds, 3 times a week, they have circles for everybody in the school community. So they have vertical tutor groups made up from year 7 through to year 11, and each adult in school is responsible for about 15 young people in one of these tutor groups, and that's every adult, and it includes the premises manager and the cooks and everybody. And I went up to observe this happening about 2 years ago. It was on a Monday morning, and at 7 o'clock on a Monday morning, all of the senior leaders were in the head's office, sitting in a circle, and that was the first circle of the day. So they went round the circle and everybody said what they'd been doing over the weekend, how they were feeling, and how ready they were for the week. And it was a circle time go round, so no sort of discussion, just taking it in turns and a sharing. Then at 7:30, we all went down into the hall, and all the adults in the school were all in their circles, which are the same circles that happen 3 times a week. And exactly the same thing happens with all the members of staff in those circles. After that, each of those adults went into their classroom and did exactly the same thing again with their vertical tutor group. And that meant that by 8:30 on a Monday morning, every single member of that school community had checked in, and any safeguarding issues that had come up over the weekend or any concerns that anybody had were made aware of. So when I sat in on one of the circles, one of the girls said that her mum was very ill, but that her aunties had come round to offer some support. So the teacher was then able to just check in with that child and make sure that everything was okay and they didn't need any further support. They do that in the middle of the week, and they do it at the end of the week. They call them coaching circles. And when I was walking around the school, it had the most amazing, happy atmosphere. This is a school, this is a local authority school. It's in an area of severe deprivation, but it felt incredibly happy and dynamic and peaceful. And the deputy head who was showing me around stopped one of the kids at random and said, "Okay, come on, what is it that you like about our school?" And the child said, "It feels like a family." we're a family here, we care about each other.
Mm.
So I would say that would be a very practical example of a school in the UK who is walking its talk and who are actually doing this.
Can I add to that? Yeah, because it's a community, because the question said, what about primary and secondary? It's a secondary school, but the primary schools that feed into it all use the same circle all the time, the check-in, the check-up, check-out. All the children are taught restorative practice. So if there's a conflict, there is a coach, a peacekeeper, if you like, in each classroom. And Simon Flowers, who's the executive principal, and Lucy Larkin, who's a principal of Kremen, have, and I've been fortunate to observe and on the periphery of this journey, but the extraordinary work that they've done here, and they have had to go through a massive change and shift of culture. But the other thing about this school is they have 63 languages spoken. They have 135 coaching groups, and what they have proven is it doesn't matter what the culture is, it's what the culture could be with simple systems consistently implemented, based around values, creativity and human dignity. Oh, and by the way, their outcomes are pretty good as well as a school.
Yeah, and I don't think they've permanently excluded anybody for several years, have they, Roy?
They've had 7 exclusions in 7 years, and that's 7 days lost in 7 years for all the primary and secondary, because inclusion is central to it. But what they've done is said, what would happen if we genuinely put children first and well-being and peace first? And this is what happens. Unfortunately, coming back to when we first started, we do have a mindset of just control in our schools. But what if we created schools where the peace ethos was totally embedded with every child and every adult every day? Well, what you'd get calm manner.
Yeah.
Thank you for elaborating and giving us a bit of hope. We have 2 questions. We are almost out of time, but let me try to get sort of somewhat succinct answers. It's going to be really difficult for you, though, I'm warning you. So I'll ask this one first. Can you speak about the differences between peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace building?
Yeah. So very quickly, peacekeeping is what the blue helmets do. You put people in detention, you make them sit apart, you have CCTV cameras, you have a proliferation of rules, so you're suppressing conflict. Peacekeeping necessary sometimes for safety, but it's negative. It leads to negative peace. Peacemaking, when a conflict has occurred, you use peacemaking techniques in order to resolve the conflict. And we are supporting schools to use methods that are more restorative and less punitive when conflicts have happened, and to empower young people to learn how to resolve their own disputes. Peace building is the only one that is proactive rather than reactive. So peace building is where you say, as a school community, what are we going to do to address structural and cultural violence within our community? What initiatives are we going to put in place? How are we going to work intergenerationally? How are we going to work within the cultures that are within our school community? How are we going to reach out to the different parts of the world? So that's where you are creating a culture that is reducing the likelihood of negative conflicts happening, but then also promoting positive peace through connections and through the work that you're doing through the curriculum.
Excellent, very succinct, very clear, thank you. And lastly then, this is a bit more challenging maybe, is how are you going to get, how are you going to get peer mediation resolving conflict? And are there any tricks to getting this working successfully?
So my PhD was investigating peer mediation. It's incredible. there are certain things that children can't and don't mediate, and that's part of their training. They have 3 days in order to have full training. They know what they can mediate. A member of staff is always supervising them and supporting them, although they're not sort of listening in whilst the mediation is actually happening necessarily. It can happen out in the playground, it can happen with very little children, even in Key Stage 2. It can happen with older students where they have a special room that they can go to. They advertise their service. The little ones like to wear badges and tabards and caps and things, and the older ones just have sort of some kind of prefect type badge. And young people come to them to bring their disputes and to achieve resolution. With the 6 and 7 year olds, it takes about 2 minutes to resolve a dispute. With Key Stage 2, that's the junior children, probably takes about 4 or 5 minutes to resolve a dispute. When you're getting into Key Stage 3, you could be looking at getting on to up to an hour. And as we all know with adults, when we have divorce mediation, commercial mediation and so on, it takes days. So there's lessons in there somewhere for how long these disputes can take to resolve. But I think if children are starting early, then it carries with them, and our mediators do tell us that they then go back home, they use it with their siblings, with their parents. It's a genuine skill for life that they have.
Did you want to add a very quick comment, Roy?
Yeah, I'd say the starting point for peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building is yourself. Most people arrive wanting to bring peace, but if they're not at peace with themselves, and it is fantastic, beautiful poem, Indra's Net by Adam Cole, who set up the whole peace training in Bradford. In his poem, he makes this point that if we are at war with ourselves, and if we can work on our own peace, then that will impact our relationships with others. And he said the boundaries between us are hallucinations. We are indeed members of one another, dancing spontaneously together like the hadrons, containing each other like the beads. And I think if we can recognize our interconnectivity with each other, we work on ourselves, and that in itself will bring some peace to the world.
Fabulous. That feels like a very fitting end. If you don't mind, Roy, having the last word, Hilary.
That's absolutely fine.
So thank you both so much, and I know you'll pass on our thanks and appreciation to Hogai, Will and Nomi, and also the comments that we've received about their work. I need to say a very big thanks to Harriet, Wills and Anne Mcfarlane, who are working in the background to make this all happen, and particularly to Jane Andre, who has been organising the whole festival and has done an amazing job. So thank you for joining us. I did mention at the beginning that there are other events taking place this week. You can find out about those via the Amnesty Central England Region webpage, or for our local events via Stamford Arts Centre on What's On page. We will, when I say we, I mean the others really, we'll be sending out an email to all of you who registered for this event in the next couple of days, and this will give you links to Cambridge Peace and Education Research Group website, and there'll be a link to the YouTube channel, so you can revisit some of this evening if you wish and look at other recordings from the festival. And we will accept donations if you feel moved to support us in that way. That will be provided in the email. So fabulous evening. Thank you so much, and we'll say good night.
Good night.
Thank you.